My name is Myra Sears, and I'm 30 years old. For 9 summers straight, my parents dropped me off at my aunt's store every June and picked me up every August so my brother could enjoy what my mother called family vacations. 9 years. 9 postcards. 9 versions of the same lesson. The day I received my high school diploma, my car was already packed. By midnight, I was unpacking in another state. And my parents didn't even know which one. Took them 4 years to find me. And when they finally did, standing in the middle of my cafe more than 2,000 miles from Ohio, my mother looked around at everything I had built. The very first words out of her mouth told me she hadn't driven all that way to apologize. She'd driven all that way to collect something. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people finally get to tell the loudest chapters of their lives. If stories about family, boundaries, and starting over speak to you, leave a comment below and be sure to subscribe. Now let me take you back to the summer I turned 8, and the little blue suitcase that started everything. The suitcase appeared on my bed on the last day of 2nd grade. It was sky blue, hard-shelled, with tiny wheels. My mother presented it like a birthday gift. "Your very own big girl suitcase," she said, smiling the same smile she always wore at church. I was 8 years old. I thought suitcases meant airplanes, and airplanes meant Disney, because that's what they had meant for my brother Danny the year before. Instead, 2 days later, we drove 5 hours north to Torch Bay, Michigan, where my Aunt Linda lived in a little greenhouse that always smelled like fresh coffee and lake water. My parents stayed just long enough for lunch. Then my father carried the blue suitcase onto the porch. My mother knelt down to my eye level and said the sentence I would hear for the rest of my childhood. "Strong kids don't make a fuss." She kissed my forehead, climbed into the car, and drove away toward the airport with Danny in the back seat, headed for Orlando. I stood on that porch and did exactly what I'd been taught to do. I didn't make a fuss. I was already good at it, and that should have worried somebody. Here's the detail it took me 20 years to say out loud. The Orlando trip had been booked in March. The suitcase was bought in April. Nobody told me anything until June, which means the plan to send me away existed for 3 whole months before anyone thought I deserved a single sentence about it. When people ask me today why I left the way I did, quietly with every detail planned far in advance, I tell them the truth. I learned that method from my mother. She just never imagined I'd be the one carrying the suitcase. Every summer after that followed exactly the same pattern. The 2nd week of June, the blue suitcase went into the trunk. 5 hours north. Lunch at Aunt Linda's kitchen table. Then the car pulled away with only 3 people inside. Sometime in July, a postcard would arrive addressed to me in my mother's cheerful, rounded handwriting. Orlando the first year. Then Yellowstone. The Grand Canyon. San Diego. Niagara Falls. 9 summers. 9 postcards. And every single one carried the exact same line across the back. "Wish you were here." Aunt Linda always handed me the card without saying a word. Later, I'd catch her quietly placing it into an old shoebox on the pantry shelf, as though she were collecting evidence for a trial nobody had scheduled yet. I used to read those postcards the way other children read cereal boxes, over and over again, searching for a prize that wasn't there. It took me years to realize what was actually missing. Not once did any postcard say, "We miss you." Not once did it promise, "Next year you'll come with us." The message was never an apology. It was simply a caption. "Look at the family enjoying its vacation." Every September my teachers assigned the same essay every kid in Ohio had to write. What I did on my summer break. I wrote about Michigan and usually earned a B+. My mother proudly taped that essay to the refrigerator right beside a photograph of Danny riding a jet ski. 2 versions of the same summer held up by the very same magnet. Around the 4th year I stopped writing those essays honestly. Nobody noticed the difference, and that told me more about my home than the postcards ever could. But the postcards weren't finished with me. Years later they would become more important than almost anything else I owned. To be fair to my parents, and I've spent years learning how to be exactly that fair, and not 1 inch more, the story didn't really begin with a suitcase. It began in a hospital. When Danny was 6 and I was only 2, he was diagnosed with leukemia. I don't remember those days myself, but I grew up inside the architecture they created. 4 years of chemotherapy, church fundraisers, a freezer packed with casseroles from kind neighbors. My mother slept beside Danny's hospital bed in a vinyl chair so many nights she learned how to fold herself into it like a pocket knife. My father worked double shifts at the printing plant just to keep the health insurance. Somewhere inside that long emergency, my family quietly reshaped itself into a world with one center, and everyone else learned to orbit around it. The center of our family had always been Danny. Understand why. When a house catches fire, everyone organizes their lives around the flames. Danny went into remission in 2003. There were balloons, a bell ringing through the hospital hallway, smiling photographs, and a celebration that still hangs framed in my parents' house. He was 10. I was 6. That should have been the end of the emergency. Instead, it became the beginning of a family tradition no one ever questioned. My parents came out of those terrifying years with one mission: make as many memories with Danny as possible because they had nearly lost the chance to make any at all. And somewhere along the way they formed another belief just as permanent. Myra is the easy one. Myra is healthy. Myra doesn't need anything. Here's the part one want you to sit with. The vacations without me didn't happen during Danny's illness. They started in 2005, 2 full years after he was declared cancer-free. The emergency ended, but the system it created never did. No one ever stopped to ask whether the little girl dragging her own blue suitcase onto Aunt Linda's porch still needed to be left behind. Triage had quietly become the way our family loved. The summer I turned 10, I finally tried to change it. Danny was going to the Grand Canyon, and I wanted to see it so badly my chest ached. I prepared like only a hopeful 10-year-old could. I packed my suitcase a week early. I wrote a list in thick black marker titled "Reasons I Should Come," and my favorite reason was simply, I've never seen anything a mile deep. I practiced my speech in the bathroom mirror until I knew every word. Then I stood in the kitchen with my list while my mother dried dishes and my father leaned against the doorway, absent-mindedly spinning his car keys around one finger. My mother set the towel down, knelt to my eye level the way she always did before delivering bad news, and spoke in a voice as soft as flannel. "This trip is for your brother, sweetheart. You understand? After everything he's been through." When my chin started to tremble despite my best effort to stop it, she tucked a strand of hair behind my ear and ended the conversation with a sentence that had become our family's creed. "Strong kids don't make a fuss." My father said nothing. Silence was always his instrument. An entire orchestra played through what he chose not to say. I went upstairs without arguing because I had already learned the rules. I heard the dishwasher start, the television come on, and the ordinary sounds of a family that had already moved on. But the sound that stayed with me for the next 20 years came later that night. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the quiet rumble of little plastic wheels rolling across the hardwood floor. I walked to the top of the stairs and looked down. My blue suitcase was already packed, zipped shut, and waiting beside the front door. I hadn't touched it. Someone had answered my request long before I ever gathered the courage to ask. In that moment, I realized my speech had never mattered. The decision had been made before I opened my mouth. I never asked to come on another family vacation again. That one night answered every summer that followed. But if this were a simpler story, those lonely summers would have been the saddest part. They weren't. That's the unexpected mercy at the heart of my childhood. Aunt Linda's little greenhouse beside the lake became the only place where I wasn't the easy one, the healthy one, or the child who didn't need anything. There I was simply Myra. Linda, my mother's older sister, had been widowed young and never had children of her own. She spent decades running the town bakery before arthritis finally slowed her hands. The first week I stayed with her, she put me to work, and not pretend work either. Real dough. Real measurements. Real customer orders taped behind the counter. The summer I turned 9, she taught me how to make pie crust, standing behind me with her weathered hands guiding mine across the rolling pin. "Cold hands, warm heart," she'd say with a smile. "Perfect for pastry." Whenever I ruined a batch, she never scolded me. She'd simply ask, "What happened?" "Too much water. Butter too warm." Then we'd make another one together. At her kitchen table, my opinions mattered. My answers changed what we baked, what we planted, what we cooked for dinner, and even what movie we watched that night. One afternoon, I overheard her introduce me to a neighbor with a smile that reached her eyes. "This is my summer girl." I carried those 3 words around for the rest of the day like someone had handed me a new name. Then, one quiet evening when I was 11, she looked across the table at me over a fresh peach pie, studied me for a long moment, and said something that changed me in ways I didn't understand until I was grown. "In this house, you're not the quiet one. You're just Myra." Then she looked like she was about to say something else, but she didn't. Instead, she stood up, refilled my glass of milk, and let the silence finish the sentence for her. Those summers were full of moments like that. Words my aunt almost spoke, truths she nearly revealed, only to pull them back at the last second, like someone walking to the edge of a dock before deciding the water was too cold. The summer I turned 12, I finally caught a glimpse of what lived on the other side of those unfinished sentences. It was late. I came downstairs for a glass of water and stopped in the dark hallway when I saw the kitchen lights still on. Aunt Linda sat alone at the table with the phone pressed tightly against her ear, and her voice carried a sharpness I'd never heard before, almost desperate. "Then let her stay with me for the school year, Carol," she pleaded. Carol was my mother. A long silence followed, so long I could hear the lake through the screen door. When Linda spoke again, her voice had turned cold. "That's not how it would look. That's your answer. That's the whole answer." Another silence. Then quietly, "No, I'm not trying to take anything from you. You can't take what's already been left on my porch." I must have made a sound, or maybe the old floorboards betrayed me, because she turned and found me standing there in my nightgown, clutching an empty glass. In an instant, the worried woman disappeared, replaced by my cheerful summer aunt. She smiled, said the school year in Torch Bay was boring anyway, nothing but slush, and gently walked me back upstairs with her warm hand resting between my shoulders. We never talked about that night again. I was only 12. I didn't understand the words, only the weight behind them, that something important had been asked, something painful had been refused, and that my aunt believed the reason was unforgivable. I tucked that memory away the way children tuck away mysteries, into a drawer that stays locked until they're old enough to open it. 10 years later, I would finally learn what Aunt Linda had offered my mother that night, what my mother had refused, and the excuse she used to justify it. Something changes in a girl the year she stops asking. My parents mistook it for maturity. My teachers called me self-sufficient, and my mother repeated the word proudly at dinner parties as though it were proof of good parenting. But it wasn't maturity. It was arithmetic. At 14, I opened a spiral notebook, wrote June 2015 across the first page, the month I would graduate high school, and beneath it I began what looked like a list but was really a countdown to freedom. I calculated everything. How much it cost to rent a room in cities I'd never seen, how much a reliable used car would cost, how much money a careful, invisible girl could save in a year. And invisible was my first language. The summer I turned 17, I carried out my first real escape plan. I asked if I could skip Michigan and stay home to work instead. My parents agreed in less than a minute. No questions. No hesitation. They were too busy packing for their 2-week vacation in Maine. "She's so independent," my mother told the neighbors with unmistakable pride. The ease of that yes told me everything I needed to know. I spent that entire summer waiting tables at a diner off Route 9. And every night I wrapped my tips with rubber bands and slipped them into an envelope taped behind the winter coats in my closet. Across the front I wrote a single word, out. By graduation, that envelope had become a shoebox holding $6,400, and not once had anyone in my house asked what I was saving for. They assumed it was college. Let them. Colleges send acceptance letters, and letters can be intercepted. I wasn't saving for tuition. I was saving for a door. I chose my future at a corner table in the Cedar Run Public Library with nothing but an atlas, a legal pad, and absolute determination. My requirements were simple. far enough away that nobody could drive there on a whim, affordable enough to survive on bakery wages until something better came along, and a place that needed bakers, because thanks to Aunt Linda, baking was the one thing my hands knew better than most adults. For weeks I turned page after page until one afternoon I found a photograph of a town wrapped around a lake so impossibly blue it looked painted. Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I stared at it for a long time and thought, it looks like Aunt Linda's lake. If her lake had grown up and moved away too. That was all it took. Some decisions aren't made, they're recognized. I found 3 cafes and a resort bakery in the business listings, copied their addresses onto my legal pad, and mailed job inquiries using my best friend Jess's return address, because her parents never opened her mail. That was the first step toward a life my family never imagined I was brave enough to build. The only person who knew where I was going was me. I didn't tell anyone, not even Aunt Linda, and keeping her in the dark was the hardest part of leaving because it felt like swallowing glass. But I knew my mother. The moment I disappeared, she would sit down with everyone who loved me, wearing that soft church smile, asking careful questions until someone broke. The only way to protect my aunt was to make sure she truly had nothing to tell. Then, in May, a letter arrived at Jess's mailbox. A small cafe on the north shore of Coeur d'Alene needed a dishwasher for the summer. The pay was terrible, but I read that letter 4 times and slept better than I had in years because, for the first time, my future had an address. Graduation came on the second Saturday of June 2015. I was awake before 5 that morning. By sunrise, my $1,900 Honda, paid for entirely with my own tip money, was packed in the driveway. The blue suitcase sat in the trunk beside a shoebox filled with $6,400 in cash, hidden beneath the spare tire. Next to it was another shoebox, one nobody would have expected, the box holding all 9 postcards Aunt Linda had quietly saved in her pantry. At 18 I called them evidence. Years later, I admitted they were really a wound I couldn't stop touching. To be fair, my parents did come to my graduation. Accuracy matters because it's the only revenge I've ever trusted. They sat through the ceremony until, about 40 minutes in, my mother leaned over and whispered they had to leave early because Danny's new job in Columbus was hosting a signing dinner and traffic would be terrible. She squeezed my wrists, smiled, and said she was proud of me. Then they walked away. When they finally called, Myra and Sellers, I crossed the stage, shook a stranger's hand, and looked out at 2 empty folding chairs with graduation programs still resting on the seats. Oddly, it didn't hurt the way I expected. It felt like a receipt, the universe handing me one final itemized list of exactly what I meant to my family. For years I'd wondered whether leaving would make me the villain. Watching those empty chairs answered the question forever. That night I ate dinner with them, said I was tired, went upstairs, and at 4 o'clock the next morning I quietly drove away. If you've ever stood just outside the frame while your family took the picture, I want you to know I see you. I left a note on the kitchen table, tucked beneath the sugar bowl so no one could mistake it for junk mail. I'd rewritten it nearly 30 times, and every version grew shorter because the truth kept shrinking into fewer words. The final note read, I'm safe. I'm an adult. Please don't look for me. I signed it simply M, the nickname Aunt Linda always used, and even now I don't know whether that was a clue or a goodbye. I backed out of the driveway with my headlights off and didn't switch them on until I reached the end of the street. 3 days. More than 2,000 miles. I slept twice in Walmart parking lots with the doors locked, the seat reclined, and that shoebox of cash tucked beneath the spare tire like a second heartbeat. Somewhere in Montana, I stopped at a gas station, removed the SIM card from my phone, and replaced it with a prepaid one I'd bought using cash back in Ohio. My old number, the one my mother knew, ended its life in a trash can outside Missoula. On the evening of the 3rd day, I crested a hill and saw Coeur d'Alene spread out below me, surrounded by towering pines and a lake so impossibly blue it looked painted. My hands tightened around the steering wheel because I couldn't afford to let them shake. I was 18 years old, everything I owned fit inside a hatchback, and not a single person in the world knew where I was. You'd think that kind of loneliness would feel like falling. Didn't. It felt like the first full breath I'd taken since I was 8. 11 days later, a police officer knocked on the door of my motel room, and the moment I opened it, I knew exactly who had sent him. But before I tell you what happened at that door, you need to understand the life I was building behind it. The cafe that hired me sat on the north shore of the lake. It was called the Lakeshore, 40 years old, with pine floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps. It belonged to Rosa Delgado, a 64-year-old woman who ran her kitchen with the precision of a naval commander. I spent 10 hours a day washing dishes until my hands cracked, and I loved every minute because every blister belonged to a life I had chosen for myself. I rented a tiny studio apartment above a garage for $300 a month. When the baseboard heater died during my first October, I never called the landlord. That detail matters because it reveals something I didn't understand about myself then. I watched repair videos at the public library, bought a $6 thermal fuse, shut off the breaker, and fixed the heater myself with my tongue pressed between my teeth in concentration. I told myself it was because I wanted to save money. The truth was darker than that. It wasn't thrift. It was doctrine. Somewhere during those 9 summers, I had absorbed my family's unwritten rule. Needing anything from anyone was a burden you should never become. I would rather sleep in the cold than knock on someone's door for help. Remember that about me because it's the flaw this entire story eventually turns on. The week before Thanksgiving, the cafe's baker sprained her wrist. Rosa walked into the dish pit, looked around the kitchen and called out, "Does anybody back here know how to bake?" In that single question, without either of us realizing it, the next chapter of my life quietly began. My hand shot up before my shyness had a chance to object. Rosa stood beside me with her arms crossed while I rolled out a test pie crust the same way Aunt Linda had taught me years earlier in her little greenhouse in Michigan. She took one bite, looked at me differently and asked, "Where did you learn to bake like that?" "My aunt," I answered. Rosa nodded once. "Then your aunt raised a baker." She walked away, and I stood there staring at that pie as if it were a passport to an entirely different life. Back in those first 11 days after I arrived, the police officer who knocked on my motel room door turned out to be younger, and far less dramatic than I'd imagined. My mother had reported me missing the day after graduation. The report followed the trail of one careless debit card purchase for gas before I switched to cash, and it ended with a welfare check outside my room. I handed him my driver's license and my brand new lease. He glanced at both, looked back at me, and asked the only question that actually mattered. "Are you here of your own free will, ma'am?" "Yes," I said. He had me sign a form confirming I was a voluntarily missing adult, then explained everything in the calm tone of someone reading a bus schedule. "Your family will be notified that you've been located and that you're safe. They will not be told where you are. That's your right. Have a good night." And that was the miracle. The system my mother thought would bring me home instead drew a legal curtain between us, one her charm, guilt, and church voice couldn't pull aside. Before I changed my phone number, one final voicemail slipped through. I stood alone in that motel room and played it once. "Myra, this is very dramatic, honey. We raised you better than this. Strong kids don't make a..." I deleted the message before she finished the sentence. For the first time in my life, I got to decide how those words ended. For the next 4 years, that unfinished sentence was the last sound of my mother's voice. 2 years into my new life, the blue suitcase was still packed beside my closet. I had an apartment, a steady job, a lease with my own name on it, yet some part of me was still standing on Aunt Linda's porch waiting for a car that would never return. One Sunday evening during my 3rd autumn in Idaho, I finally unzipped the suitcase for good. At the bottom sat the old shoebox containing all 9 postcards, from Orlando to Niagara Falls, each one written in my mother's cheerful handwriting. "Wish you were here." I carried the box behind the cafe where Rosa kept a steel burn barrel and stood there with a lighter in my hand for a long time. Then I walked back inside. Not because I'd forgiven anyone, but because burning them felt like disappearing one more time, and I was done solving pain by making myself vanish. Instead, I sat at the counter after closing with a pen and turned every postcard over. Beneath my mother's cheerful caption, I wrote what that summer had actually been. Summer 3. I taught myself to swim because nobody was there to watch me. Summer 5. I stopped crying at drop-off, and everyone praised me for being so strong. Summer 8. Aunt Linda asked what I wanted, and I couldn't answer because nobody had ever asked before. 9 postcards. 2 handwritings. 2 completely different versions of the same childhood. I placed the shoebox on the shelf above my stove where people keep the things that matter. I told myself they were receipts. The truth was, some part of me still hoped that one day someone would ask to read the other side. By my 3rd year, I had become Lakeshore Cafe's head baker, and more often than not I was running the kitchen whenever Rosa's arthritis made mornings difficult, a fact she'd never willingly admit. She was 66 when she sat across from me one snowy February afternoon with 2 mugs of coffee and laid out the future in the straightforward way she handled everything. She wanted to retire while she could still enjoy her garden. The cafe was worth about $180,000 with all the equipment. She'd received offers from a chain restaurant and another from a man who wanted to turn the dining room into a vape lounge, an idea she nearly threw him out for suggesting. "I'm not selling 40 years of my life to someone who'll gut it," she said. "I'd rather sell it slowly to someone who'll love it." Then she looked directly at me. "$40,000 down. I'll finance the rest myself with monthly payments. The old-fashioned way. For someone I trust." She let the silence do the rest. That night I went home, taped a sheet of graph paper inside my closet door, wrote $40,000 across the top, and underneath penciled the amount I actually had, $23,400. For the next 18 months, that chart became my religion. Every tip, every overtime shift, every dollar I didn't spend moved the number a little higher. No streaming subscriptions. Boots repaired instead of replaced. Extra shifts whenever they were available. 26,000. 31,000. 38,000. Every small sacrifice brought me one step closer to owning the first place that had ever truly felt like home. People talk about buying a business, but that isn't what this was. This was the first thing I'd ever wanted out loud, without apologizing for wanting it. The first dream that belonged entirely to me. A place with my name on the deed, in a town I chose, where no one could ever again decide which members of a family mattered and which ones didn't. Rosa had only one condition. "Don't disappear on me," she said. I laughed. I didn't. I need to tell you about the one thread I never cut because without it, nothing that happens later makes sense. Every year during the 2nd week of June, I bought a postcard of Lake Coeur d'Alene, the tourist kind with that impossible blue water. I made sure there was no return address, no town name visible on the picture, nothing that could lead anyone back to me. On the back, where most people wrote messages, I drew a tiny pie with a carefully crimped crust, the same way I'd doodle one on a napkin, and I mailed it to Aunt Linda's greenhouse in Torch Bay, Michigan. The first year, I stood at the mailbox for nearly 10 minutes before I let it go, running every possible consequence through my head. I knew my mother would question Linda. I knew every holiday would become an interrogation. I knew I was asking her to carry a secret for me without ever asking whether she wanted that burden. But the alternative was worse. I couldn't let the one person who had truly loved me spend years wondering whether I was alive. So I mailed it. Linda never wrote back because she had no address to send a letter to. But every June, I trusted she'd understand the little pie. 4 postcards over 4 years. That was our entire conversation. No names. No words. Just proof that I was still here. What I didn't know until much later was how much protecting that secret cost her every time the family gathered around another holiday table in Ohio. My safety had a price. She simply never sent me the bill. The article that changed everything was Rosa's idea, and I want that on the record because I'd spent 4 years living by one rule. Stay small, stay invisible, stay impossible to find. A writer from North Idaho Living was doing a feature on beloved local businesses and had heard about our huckleberry pie. Rosa, who had never met a spotlight she didn't immediately hand to someone else, volunteered me. The reporter wanted the baker's name. She wanted a photograph beside the ovens. Every alarm inside me went off. But then I looked around the cafe. The slow winter coming, Rosa's aching hands, the graph paper in my apartment tracking every dollar toward owning this place, and I finally admitted something I had been refusing to face. A business can't survive if nobody knows it exists. You can't build a future while hiding from the world forever. So I said yes. I stood beside the ovens in a clean apron, smiled for the camera, and 3 weeks later the article appeared. The Huckleberry Pie worth crossing the lake for. Underneath the headline was my name, Myra Sellers. For the first time in my adult life, my face was printed somewhere under my own name. For about 2 weeks, I felt proud in a way that was completely unfamiliar, like walking across a brand new floor and testing whether it would hold my weight. Then the magazine posted the story online, and the internet has no state lines. 11 days later, a distant cousin from Cedar Run left one short comment beneath my photo. "Isn't this Carol's girl?" It was a Tuesday in late October 2019, that quiet hour between breakfast and lunch. I was boxing up a pie order behind the counter when the bell above the cafe door chimed. Without looking up, I called, "We'll be right with you." Then I raised my eyes. My mother was standing in the middle of my cafe. For years. 2,000 miles. And somehow she was standing there between table 6 and the pastry case, wearing her good wool coat, her hair a little grayer than the version I'd spent years arguing with in my memories. Behind her stood my father, holding the door open the same way he had my entire childhood. Silent, steady, saying nothing. He looked smaller than I remembered, and one hand trembled constantly at his side like a phone vibrating on silent. Some detached part of my mind noticed it before my heart could react. Nobody moved. The espresso machine hissed. Steam drifted into the quiet. My mother slowly swept her eyes across everything I'd built. The handwritten chalkboard menu, the framed newspaper article beside the register, the Lakeshore Cafe apron tied twice around my waist because it had always been made for someone larger. She looked at every inch of the life I'd created without them. Then she looked at me. And the first words out of her mouth told me she hadn't driven 2,000 miles to apologize. She had driven 2,000 miles because she believed there was still something here that belonged to her. For years, I remember thinking that whatever came out of my mother's mouth first would tell me everything, because in our family, the first sentence always did. She finished inspecting the cafe, then looked at me. At the life I'd built, steady, successful, and completely my own. Her lips pressed together in that familiar way they always did just before the church smile appeared. Then she said, "So this is what you left your family for?" In that instant, I knew they hadn't driven 2,000 miles for an apology. They had driven 2,000 miles to collect something they believed still belonged to them. I poured them coffee, and I want you to understand why. It wasn't weakness. A woman who truly owns her ground can afford to pour coffee on it. They sat at the counter like ordinary customers while my mother spent the next 20 minutes telling me the authorized version of my childhood. I listened the way you'd listen to a tour guide describe your own house. In her version, I'd spent 9 wonderful summers with Aunt Linda because I adored being there. In her version, they had given me independence, the greatest gift parents could offer. "Look how well it turned out," she said, gesturing around the cafe. "Look at everything you've built." In her version, my disappearance had simply been a rebellious phase, a painful season she had endured with grace, and there was no reason to reopen old wounds now that I'd finally gotten it out of my system. What frightened me wasn't what she said. It was how completely she believed it. You can hear a lie when someone tells one. This wasn't that. My mother believed every word the way people believe roads they've driven their entire lives. Somewhere over the years, she had built a version of our family where every sacrifice was love, every exclusion was necessary, and every decision had been made for my own good. She lived inside that story so comfortably she had never once thought to check what was buried underneath it. My father said almost nothing, which had always been his native language. His fingers tapped an uneven rhythm against the countertop, a tremor he didn't seem to notice. Twice I caught him staring at the framed newspaper article with my name beneath the headline, wearing an expression I had no memory attached to. Finally, I asked the question 4 years had sharpened into a blade. Why did it take you so long to find me? If any of this had mattered, why had it taken 4 years? My father opened his mouth for the first time since walking through the door. "I did," he whispered. Before he could finish, my mother's hand settled lightly on his sleeve, and the words disappeared. Then she folded her hands on the counter and finally revealed the real reason for the trip. "Your father has Parkinson's." She said it as calmly as someone reading tomorrow's weather forecast. "Diagnosed in the spring. Early stage. The tremor. The stiffness. You've already noticed his hand." Then she let the silence do its work while I stood there gripping the coffee pot, feeling that single word rearrange the man sitting in front of me into someone I was going to lose twice, first to the disease and then to time. My father looked at me and gave the smallest apologetic shrug, as though Parkinson's were an inconvenience he'd accidentally invited into the house. But my mother wasn't finished, because the diagnosis wasn't the point. It was only the runway leading to the request. "Danny can't be expected to manage this," she said. "He has children. He has a career. You understand." The words slipped perfectly into the grooves carved by 9 childhood summers. Danny had needs. I had strength. The equation had never changed. She reached across the counter, wrapped her fingers around my wrist exactly the way she had on graduation day, and spoke the sentence she'd driven 6 states to deliver. "You've always been the strong one, Myra. It's time to come home." "Home for Thanksgiving," she explained. "We tell everyone together. Family announcement." She was already planning the guest list before I'd answered. I looked down at her hand resting on my wrist and noticed the details. The French manicure, her mother's wedding ring, the familiar grip that had guided my entire childhood. Strangely, it felt almost weightless. 4 years. 2,000 miles. A legal curtain between us. My own lease. My own business. A life built one plank at a time with cracked hands and stubborn hope. And the very first complete sentence my mother offered me was another assignment. The position of the strong one had become vacant, and she had come to hire me back. I gently lifted her hand from my wrist, the way you'd carefully take a sharp knife away from a child. Then I answered with a single word. No. No speech. No tears. No angry manifesto. Just one quiet word. After that, I glanced toward the dining room, where the lunch crowd would begin arriving in less than 20 minutes, and calmly told them the kitchen needed me. Before they started the long drive home, I suggested they try a slice of the huckleberry pie. My mother's expression shifted through surprise, disappointment, and finally settled into wounded dignity, the face she wore better than any other. Through the cafe window, I watched my mother quietly guide my father back toward the car. Just before he climbed in, he looked back at me once. I didn't wave, and neither did he. Somehow, that silent glance was the most honest conversation the 3 of us had managed all morning. That night, my phone rang from an Ohio number I didn't recognize. It was Danny. My mother had given him the number she'd insisted I hand over at the cafe, the only thing I'd surrendered simply to end the visit. I almost let it ring. I'm grateful I didn't, because I promised myself long ago that if I told this story, I'd be fair to everyone. Exactly fair. No more, no less. Danny didn't begin with the family script. He didn't tell me to come home or accuse me of abandoning anyone. Instead, he asked one quiet, unsteady question. Was it true that you hated going to Aunt Linda's? I took a slow breath before answering. I never hated Linda's, I told him. I hated what it meant. Then, for the first time in my life, I explained everything. The blue suitcase that appeared every April, the porch where I stood watching their car disappear, the postcards that always said "wish you were here" while proving they never actually wished I was. The line went so silent I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Finally, my 26-year-old brother whispered, "Mom always told me you loved being there." I believed her. His voice cracked on the last 2 words. He never asked me to come back. He never asked me to take care of Dad. He only asked one thing. Don't disappear on me again. After we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at the old shoebox on the shelf above my stove. Here's the part no one warns you about. Cutting contact is one decision. Staying gone is a decision you wake up and make again every single morning. If you've ever had to choose between your peace and your family's version of who you were supposed to be, you already know that feeling. The next evening I called Aunt Linda. The moment she heard my voice instead of receiving another silent postcard, she knew something had happened. "They found me," I said, and I told her everything. The cafe, the coffee, my parents' visit, and my mother's invitation to come home. Linda was quiet for a long moment before taking a deep breath, as though she were finally paying off a debt she'd carried for 10 years. "You were 12, she said softly. "You came downstairs for water that night. I know you heard part of my conversation. Here's the part you never heard. That summer, she had offered to take me for the entire school year. Not another summer visit, permanently. I would have been enrolled in school in Torch Bay. I would have had my own bedroom. She had offered to pay every expense herself while my parents focused entirely on Danny. She had imagined me growing up in a house where someone actually looked up when I walked into a room. She'd already drafted most of the paperwork before making the call. She had rehearsed the conversation for weeks. My mother listened to the entire proposal and refused it without hesitation. Not because she'd miss me. Not because she couldn't bear to let me go. Her exact reason, Linda repeated after all those years, was simple. Think how it would look. A daughter sent away permanently would make people ask questions. A daughter who spent summers with her aunt. That was wholesome. That was cousins camp. 9 summers was apparently the maximum amount of absence my childhood could bear, while the family portrait still looked complete to everyone else. Standing alone in my Idaho kitchen with the phone pressed against my ear, I finally did the one piece of arithmetic I'd spent my entire adult life avoiding. It had never been thoughtlessness. It had never been an accident. It had been policy. Then Linda said something that broke my heart all over again. "I should have fought harder, sweetheart." After a pause, she added, "Come to Thanksgiving with me. Not for them. For you. So you'll never again have to wonder who you would have been in that house." I barely slept over the next 3 nights. I'd like to tell you I spent those hours wrestling with my parents, but the truth is I kept staring at a single sheet of graph paper taped inside my closet. $38,700. That's where my savings stood. Only $700 short of the down payment Rosa needed before she'd finally hand me the keys to the cafe I'd spent 4 years working toward. Going back to Ohio wasn't just buying a plane ticket. It felt like punching a hole in the hull of the life I'd built with my own hands. And I knew exactly why it terrified me. If that house ever got its hooks into me again, the strong one would do what the strong one had always done. She would absorb. She would accommodate. She would quietly disappear while standing right in the middle of the room. It was the only kind of disappearing I had never escaped. On the 4th morning, I finally made my decision. On the 4th morning, I did something I'd never done in my entire adult life. I asked for help, and I told the whole truth while I was asking for it. Before the cafe opened, I sat Rosa down at her favorite corner table and told her everything. Ohio. The summers. The blue suitcase. My father's trembling hand. The number on the graph paper taped inside my closet. And the fear that Thanksgiving might cost me not only money, but the courage I'd spent 4 years building. Rosa listened without interrupting, her arms folded across her chest until I'd emptied every last word. Then she said quietly, "This cafe has been here for 40 years. It can wait 3 weeks." She paused, looked me straight in the eye, and asked the one question that settled everything. "Can you?" I booked my flight that afternoon. Spokane to Columbus the day before Thanksgiving. Then I did something I couldn't fully explain, even to myself. I pulled the old blue suitcase out from under my bed and packed it. For 4 years it had sat there untouched, retired like an artifact from another life. If I was walking back into that house, I wanted to carry the same suitcase they had packed for me every summer of my childhood. Call it a witness. Some evidence you carry. Some evidence carries you. Aunt Linda met me at the Columbus airport after driving down from Michigan. The moment I saw her standing in the arrivals terminal, her hair grayer now but still scanning every face the way she'd once searched the beach for me, more of my composure disappeared than the entire flight had managed to take away. We checked into a motel near the interstate instead of staying with family, and I want that detail to matter. Two grown women with relatives 10 minutes away still chose a motel because a boundary you can't walk away from isn't a boundary at all. It's just another guest room. That evening we stopped by my parents' house for a brief courtesy visit before Thanksgiving dinner. And my childhood home quietly performed an autopsy on itself. Every hallway wall belonged to Danny. Little League, the remission bell, prom, college, his wedding, a museum with only one exhibit. I appeared twice. Both times in class photos where I was just one face among 24. My old bedroom had become a yoga studio. My mother announced it cheerfully, as though she'd renovated an investment property instead of erasing a daughter. Then my eyes drifted to the top of the kitchen hutch, where I saw another shoebox. Inside were duplicates of the same 9 postcards she'd mailed me every summer, carefully arranged in a wicker basket like treasured family keepsakes. That's when I realized we had both preserved the same childhood in completely different ways. Hers sat on display for visitors to admire. Mine rested on a shelf above my stove in Idaho, each postcard turned over with the truth written across the back in my own handwriting. The same 9 cards. 2 completely different museums. As Linda and I were leaving, my father quietly walked me to the porch. Beneath the familiar porch light, he slipped a small folded note into my hand, folded the careful way men of his generation fold every feeling they can't bring themselves to say aloud. His hand trembled against mine. Whether it was Parkinson's or regret, I couldn't tell. "Read it later," was all he said. I slipped the note into my coat pocket, where it seemed to weigh more heavily with every passing hour. Thanksgiving arrived exactly the way my mother staged every holiday, as though she were directing the grand finale of a television series. 12 people gathered around the table. Both extension leaves were in place. The good china with its gold trim came out. The napkins had been folded into elaborate swans, something I've never seen in another American home. The guest list included my great-uncle Ray and his wife, 2 of my mother's cousins, the neighbors Carol collected like trophies, Danny and his wife Kate, and their 3-year-old daughter Ellie, who orbited the dessert table like a tiny moon. Linda and I arrived carrying a white bakery box with a single huckleberry pie inside. And if you think it was just dessert, you haven't been listening. My hands had baked that pie. Linda's hands had taught mine. For one afternoon, Michigan, Idaho, and Ohio would all sit together in the middle of the same table. My mother greeted us with her brightest church smile. "There she is, our world traveler," she announced. "Doesn't she look thin?" Little Ellie peeked shyly from behind Kate's leg, studying me as though I were a stranger from another country. My father sat at the head of the table, and I watched his trembling hand steady a glass of water before quickly looking away when he caught me watching. Dinner unfolded peacefully enough. Small talk, casseroles, highway construction, and Uncle Ray's opinions about traffic. Then the turkey was carved. The mashed potatoes made another trip around the table, and my mother stood. She tapped her wine glass with a spoon. Ding, ding, ding. The room fell silent. "Before we eat," she said with a practiced smile, "I have some wonderful news to share with the family." Here's the thing about my mother and me. We had both come to that Thanksgiving table carrying an announcement. She simply believed hers would be the only one anyone would hear. Standing at the head of the table like a woman who had rehearsed every word, she began softly. "As many of you know, Frank has been having some health problems. The doctors have confirmed that it's Parkinson's disease." And just like that, the table did what families always do when bad news arrives. It fell completely silent. The room reacted exactly the way bad news always makes a family react. A soft gasp rippled across the table. Uncle Ray's wife lifted a hand to her collarbone. Quiet murmurs of, "Oh, Frank," and "Carol, I'm so sorry," drifted through the dining room. My father stared down at his plate through all of it, looking less like the guest of honor than a man forced to attend his own funeral. Then my mother gently lifted her chin, changed her tone, and shifted from tragedy to triumph, the moment she'd driven 2,000 miles to create. "But here's the wonderful news," she said brightly. "Myra is moving home to help take care of her father." She let the announcement settle before adding the garnish she'd been saving. "She's always been the strong one. The room exploded with exactly the response she'd expected. Uncle Ray raised his beer and grinned. "That's my girl." One of my cousins actually applauded. 3 polite little claps. The neighbor dabbed tears from her eyes with one of the swan-shaped napkins and whispered, "What a wonderful daughter." My mother accepted every word with the practiced humility of someone conducting an orchestra she had rehearsed for years. Then her hand came to rest on my shoulder, and I realized something with startling clarity. I wasn't sitting at that table as a guest. I was the announcement. I was the centerpiece, displayed beside the turkey for everyone else's approval. I looked around at 12 smiling faces celebrating a decision about my life that no one had ever bothered to ask me to make. The feeling of déjà vu hit so hard it was almost physical. A trip planned in March. A suitcase bought in April. A daughter informed in June. 15 years had passed, but the machine was still running exactly as it always had. The only difference was that this time, the machine had never imagined one of its parts might refuse to move. Then, in the middle of the applause, a tiny voice cut straight through the room. Little Ellie pointed her fork at me and looked up at her mother. "Who's that lady?" she asked. Kate immediately tried to shush her, cheeks turning bright red, but it was too late. The question hung over the dining room like smoke. Because out of every person seated around that table, the 3-year-old had spoken the only truth nobody else could. The family's so-called strong one was a complete stranger to its youngest member. My brother stared down at his plate. My father slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine. I folded my napkin, placed it carefully beside my plate, and stood. Running a small business had taught me something family dinners never had. You never beat noise by becoming louder. You beat it by becoming quieter until everyone has to lean in to hear you. So I waited until the last chuckle disappeared, and then I spoke in the same calm voice you'd use to read a bedtime story. "You're right, Mom," I said. "I never made a fuss. I made a life." After 22 years of sitting at that table like another piece of furniture, I finally had the floor. I kept every sentence short, deliberate, impossible to misunderstand. "I'm not moving home." Uncle Ray shifted in his chair as though he wanted to interrupt, then wisely thought better of it. "But nobody in this family is going to say I abandoned my father." Every face turned toward me. "Here's what's actually going to happen." I explained that during the previous week I'd already arranged professional home care through a licensed agency in Columbus, the same one recommended by Dad's neurologist. A nurse would begin visiting 3 mornings a week, increasing hours whenever his condition required. Every invoice would be mailed directly to me in Idaho. Everything had already been scheduled. The first visit would happen on Monday. I didn't tell them what it cost. I'll tell you, because you've earned the arithmetic. It cost almost every dollar I'd spent 4.5 years saving. The graph paper, the postponed dreams, the boots I never replaced, the streaming services I never subscribed to. The down payment I'd counted and recounted until I knew every digit by heart. One phone call had redirected nearly all of it. Rose's handshake would have to wait, and I had no idea for how long. My mother's expression cycled through every emotion she knew how to perform: shock, injury, disbelief, before settling on authority. "After everything this family has given you," she began. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "You gave me a suitcase, Mom," I said softly. "Every June." Silence swallowed the room. No fork moved. No glass clinked. I watched Uncle Ray's wife slowly turn toward my mother, and for the first time in my life, that look didn't bounce harmlessly away. Then I continued. "Second, I'll visit Dad twice a year, and I'll call him every Sunday. I will come as his daughter, not as unpaid labor. As a guest who is invited, not assigned." I paused one final time before delivering the only sentence that truly mattered. "And third, my name is officially retired from family announcements. From this moment on," I said, "nothing about my life will ever be announced to a room full of people unless I'm the one standing to announce it. That's the boundary. It isn't a discussion. It isn't a negotiation. My mother slowly lowered her wine glass until it clicked against the table. Then she reached for the oldest weapon she'd ever owned. "If you walk out of this house," she said, "don't bother coming back." There it was, the final invoice, delivered in front of witnesses. In the official family version, the daughter who paid for the nurses, promised Sunday phone calls, and flew across the country would become the selfish daughter who abandoned her sick father on Thanksgiving. I knew the story she'd tell before I even reached the front door. I accepted the price anyway. I looked at her and said quietly, "That house key hasn't fit me since I was 8 years old." Then my father pushed his chair back. He gripped the edge of the table, struggled to his feet, and the entire room stopped breathing. Before he could force a single word past his chest, something even more unexpected happened. My mother broke. Not into tears. She never cried in front of the good china. She broke script, and for her that was far more revealing. Still clutching the edge of the table, she spoke to no one in particular. Her voice stripped of every performance I'd ever known. "I was 12, she whispered. Every face turned toward her. "I was 12 when my mother's legs gave out. Linda was already 18 and working 2 states away. Somebody had to cook. Somebody had to wash clothes. Somebody had to help her to the bathroom in the middle of the night." She swallowed hard. "It was me. It was always me." Then she said the sentence she'd spent half a century refusing to hear herself say. "Nobody ever asked me either." Silence filled the room. In that single sentence I finally saw the entire machine. The blue suitcase. The postcards. Family motto. "You're the strong one." None of it had begun with my mother. She hadn't invented the system. She had inherited it, the same way people inherit dining tables, recipes, and old grief. She had once been a 12-year-old girl standing on a stool in front of a stove that was too tall for her, surviving by convincing herself that never being asked was something to be proud of. Then years later, she pinned that same invisible medal onto her own daughter because it was the only language of love she'd ever been taught. For one long moment, I saw the child she used to be instead of the woman she had become. I came closer than I ever had to forgiving her. Then Aunt Linda spoke, her voice soft enough that everyone had to lean in to hear it. "Carol, she's not you. Was. Let her go." My mother looked at me. I looked back at her and answered with the only sentence that was both honest and kind. "I know, Mom. Nobody ever asked you." I took a slow breath. That's exactly why I'm ending it. So no one at this table ever has to earn their place the way you did. They don't have to be chosen. They just get to belong. She never answered. She simply sat down again, perfectly straight, staring at the folded swan napkins as though they might somehow explain where the story had gone wrong. Then I turned toward the only other person still standing, my father. He rested both hands on the table, the tremor traveling through the cider glasses like tiny ripples across a lake. Everyone waited for a speech, but 40 years working at a printing press had taught him to let other people supply the words. Instead, he looked at me and quietly said, "Read it." So I did, right there, in front of everyone. Because he'd earned witnesses, and so had I. I unfolded the paper he'd slipped into my pocket beneath the porch light. It wasn't a letter. It was a photocopy of an invoice dated August 2016, 14 months after I'd disappeared. Kestrel Investigations. Columbus, Ohio. Retainer. Skip trace. Locate attempt. Across the bottom, stamped in red, were the words, "No result. Case closed at client request." Beneath that, in my father's familiar pressman's handwriting, once steady, now uneven with Parkinson's, he had written a single note. "Found nothing. Your mother said to stop. She said you'd come back when you needed us." Stop. I shouldn't have. Sorry. Dad. I stood there holding proof that for 14 months my father had searched for me. It didn't erase the years before it. It didn't repair the damage. He had hired an investigator instead of raising his voice. And when the search failed, he had done what he'd always done. He folded. But unlike the rest of us, he had written his failure down. That piece of paper wasn't just an apology. It was a confession. The only honest document anyone at that table had ever produced. And it carried one more truth. Before the family rewrote the story into one where I had simply abandoned them, someone had actually gone looking. I folded the paper carefully, the same way my father folded everything he couldn't bring himself to say, and slipped it into my pocket to keep forever. Then I stepped around the table, placed my hand over his trembling one, and said softly, "The nurse starts Monday, Dad. And whenever you're ready to visit Idaho, I'll teach you how to make pie." Linda helped me into my coat on the same front porch where, years earlier, a little blue suitcase had waited every June. Standing there, I finally finished the sentence I'd been writing since I was 8 years old. It took them 4 years to find me, but it took me 9 summers to stop waiting to be found. 1 year later, because I promised you accuracy instead of fairy tales. Here's what happened. The nurse's name was Patrice, and she arrived that very Monday. My dad began sending me blurry flip phone photos, usually half his thumb, half his face. The first one showed him and Patrice frowning into the camera like reluctant hostages, captioned, "She counts my pills the way your mother counts silverware." It was the longest joke he'd made in years. I talk every Sunday now. The calls are short, but where I come from, enough is a fortune. My mother and I never spoke again. At Christmas, a tasteful card arrived in Idaho. There was no letter inside, only her careful signature, Mom. Not love, not I'm sorry. Just the title she still wasn't ready to surrender. Some doors don't slam shut. Some simply settle closed. In March, Rosa and I signed the papers for the cafe. When she saw I was still short on the down payment, she quietly crossed out $40,000 and wrote 25 instead, stretching the remaining balance over several more years. It would cost me more in the end, but I signed with a smile because I finally understood that a dream carrying a little debt is still a dream worth owning. A few weeks later, a new line appeared on the cafe door beneath Rosa's name, painted exactly the way I'd asked. M. Sellers, proprietor. Small letters. A life built quietly. That July, my brother Danny drove up with his little daughter, Ellie. They stayed 4 days. Ellie devoured huckleberry pie with both hands and decided my official title was Aunt Pie, a promotion I accepted immediately. On their last morning, Danny stood silently in front of the shoebox above my stove, reading all 9 postcards. My mother's cheerful messages covered one side. My own handwritten truths filled the other. When he finished, he squared the cards, placed them back in the box and whispered, "I'm sorry I never turned them over." That was the only apology I received from my family that year, and it was the only one that truly mattered. The following Thanksgiving, I closed the cafe to customers and pushed every table together into one impossibly long line stretching from the kitchen to the front windows. We invited everyone who had nowhere else to go. Employees, regulars, the new dishwasher whose family was in Guatemala, Gus the widower who always tipped in firewood, neighbors, travelers, anyone who needed a place to belong. 22 chairs. No seating chart. No announcements. No favorites. Rosa said grace in English and Spanish. Linda flew across the country, the first plane she'd boarded in over a decade, and I seated her at the head of the table because every kingdom deserves to watch its true queen eat first. Before dessert, I handed her a postcard. On the front was Lake Curtin, impossibly blue. On the back, in my own handwriting, I had written the same words that once carried so much loneliness. "Wish you were here." She read it, laughed, then looked slowly down the length of that crowded table toward the lake beyond the windows, and for the first time in my life, the person that postcard was meant for was already sitting beside me. The old blue suitcase now lives on top of my pantry, filled with holiday tablecloths instead of escape plans. Twice a year I pull it down, unfold the linens, and set the longest table in town with the very luggage that was once meant to teach me how to leave quietly. If my story leaves you with one truth, let it be this. Family isn't defined by blood, names, or obligation. Family is made of the people who never need to send you a postcard because they never let you become the one who's missing. 9 summers. 1 blue suitcase. 1 cafe with my name on the door. And, at last, a table where everyone belongs.